The door burst open before Paul Morgan could even raise his fist to knock a second time, and Mamie Conley stood in the frame with a shotgun leveled at his chest, her dark eyes blazing with something that was equal parts fury and devastation. "You knew," she said. Her voice did not shake. That was what broke him. It was perfectly, dangerously still. "You stood on that hill every morning and watched my claim. For 2 years. And you knew what Harlan Decker was doing to the assay records, and you said nothing." Paul's hands went up slowly, palms out, the way a man raises them when he understands he has no defense worth offering. The Nevada sky behind him was the color of a bruise, the last light of August 1882 bleeding out behind the ridgeline. He could smell the sage and the dust and the faint metallic bite of the silver ore that had defined every single day of their strange, silent proximity. 2 years of watching her fight. 2 years of cowardice dressed up as respect. "Mamie, do not say my name like you know me, Paul Morgan." Her finger was not on the trigger, but it was close enough to remind him that she was not a woman who made empty gestures. "Decker's men came this morning. They had a court document. They said my claim has been reassigned because the original filing was fraudulent. My filing. Mine." Her jaw tightened. "Now, you are the only person in 40 miles who works for the county assessor's office. So you are going to stand right there, and you are going to tell me the truth, or I am going to remove you from my property the same way I removed the last man who thought he could take what belongs to me." The shotgun did not waver. Paul Morgan looked at the woman he had loved in silence for 730 days, and he understood with a clarity that felt like a knife between the ribs that his cowardice had not protected her at all. It had only left her alone to be destroyed. "I didn't know he was forging the records," he said, and the words felt like swallowing gravel. "But I knew something was wrong with the filings on your section. I noticed it 8 months ago. I didn't report it because Decker threatened to have my predecessor dismissed and charged, and I was afraid of what he'd do to the whole office. That was wrong. I was a coward, and you have every right to shoot me." Silence stretched between them, long and taut as a telegraph wire in the cold. Then, slowly, Mamie Conley lowered the shotgun, not because she forgave him, not yet, but because she was a practical woman and a dead accountant could not help her fight. "Get inside," she said, "and start talking." To understand how Paul Morgan came to be standing on that porch with his hands in the air, and his heart cracked clean down the middle, you had to go back to the autumn of 1880, to the day he first arrived in the small silver mining settlement of Caldwell Flat, Nevada, with a letter of appointment from the Elko County Assessor's office folded in his breast pocket, and absolutely no idea what he was walking into. Paul was 28 years old that October, a lean, quiet man with brown hair that the desert sun would bleach to something closer to gold within a month, and careful gray eyes that cataloged everything around him the way a ledger cataloged figures. He had grown up in Ohio, trained as a bookkeeper in Cincinnati, and had applied for the assessor's posting on something between impulse and desperation after a broken engagement, and a business failure had left him feeling like a man who needed the world to be dramatically wider than the one he currently inhabited. Nevada had seemed about as wide as a world could get. He had ridden into Caldwell Flat on a Tuesday morning, his saddlebag containing 3 ledger books, 2 changes of clothes, a copy of Thoreau's essays, and a Remington revolver he had never once fired at a living thing. The town was small and sun-hammered and smelled of sulfur from the processing mill at its southern edge. There was a hotel, a dry goods store, a saloon called the Copper King, a small church that doubled as a schoolroom on weekdays, a sheriff's office where the sheriff was often not present, and a scattering of residences that ranged from proper timber frame houses to canvas-roof dugouts. The county had assigned him a modest claim plot on the eastern edge of town as part of his compensation, adjacent to the formal assessor's office building, which was really just a single-room structure with a counter and 3 filing cabinets. He had walked his assigned property line on his first afternoon in Caldwell Flat, pacing the boundary with a surveyor's chain, and that was when he first saw her. She was working on the claim immediately north of his assigned lot, and she was moving a section of wooden sluice channel with her bare hands, repositioning it over a dry gulch with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this labor many times before. She wore a canvas work dress that had been patched at the elbows and a wide-brimmed felt hat that had seen better years, and she did not look up when he approached the low stone boundary marker between their properties, even though she must have heard him because the desert in autumn was very quiet. "Property line's right there," she said without lifting her eyes from the sluice joint she was fitting. "Don't cross it and we'll get along fine," he had said somewhat foolishly. "I wasn't planning to." She had looked up then, just briefly, just enough for him to register that she had dark brown eyes and a direct gaze that made him feel assessed in a way that no examination he had ever sat had quite achieved. Then she looked back at her work. "Good," she said. He had introduced himself anyway. She had told him her name was Mamie Conley, and that she had held the claim for 14 months, and that she was not looking for conversation or assistance or any other variety of neighborly interference. She had said it pleasantly enough, but the meaning was absolutely clear. He had gone back to his side of the boundary marker and stood there a little longer than was necessary, watching her work with a feeling in his chest that was unfamiliar enough that he spent the rest of the evening trying to name it. Mamie Conley, he discovered in the following weeks through the ordinary social metabolism of a small settlement, was 30 years old, a widow, and originally from Missouri. Her husband, a man named Conley, had died of a fever 18 months before Paul's arrival, leaving her with a half-worked silver claim, a mule named August, and enough stubbornness to build a cathedral with. She had no family in the territory. She had no close friends in the settlement, though she was not disliked, merely regarded with the particular wariness that independent women in the West reliably provoked in people who were uncomfortable with the category. She had continued Cole's work on the claim, learning what she had not already known, expanding the shaft, arranging for a local mill to process her ore at a reasonable rate. She had made a modest but real income from the claim for over a year by the time Paul arrived. She kept to herself. She bought her supplies at the dry goods store every other Saturday, had a brief and cordial exchange of words with the proprietor's wife, and then returned to her claim. She was the most self-contained person Paul had ever observed, and he found her absolutely fascinating. He did not knock on her door. He told himself he was respecting her stated preference for solitude. He told himself she was a woman in a difficult situation, and the last thing she needed was a neighbor making demands on her time and attention. He told himself many sensible, reasonable things over the course of that first autumn, and all of them were true, and none of them were the actual reason. The actual reason was simpler and more embarrassing. Mamie Conley was remarkable in a way that made Paul Morgan feel the full, unflattering weight of his own ordinariness, and he did not know what on earth he would say if she opened the door and looked at him with those dark, direct eyes and expected him to be interesting. So he watched, from a respectful distance. He watched her drive her mind supports in the early mornings when the air was still cold, the hammer strokes regular and confident. He watched her negotiate the ore rate with the mill foreman, a broad, skeptical man named Pickett, and he watched her win the negotiation. He watched her patch her cabin roof after the November wind tore up one corner, working from a ladder with the unhurried focus of someone who had decided that panic was simply not a useful tool. He watched her read in the evenings when the light was good, sitting in the open doorway of her cabin with a book on her knee, and he never got close enough to see the title. He kept excellent ledger records. He did his job honestly and thoroughly, and he found the work genuinely interesting, because the economics of a small silver mining settlement in the early 1880s were surprisingly intricate, and Paul was a man who found intricacy satisfying. He learned the claim boundaries and production figures and water rights disputes and mill rates until he knew the economic anatomy of Caldwell Flat, the way a physician knows the human body. That was how, 8 months before the story's beginning, he noticed the anomaly in Mamie Conley's filing records. Harlan Decker was not a subtle man in most respects, but he had been buying up silver claims in the region for 3 years with a methodical patience that suggested he had access to advice and capital beyond what the territory's surface appearance would indicate. He was 50 years old, heavyset, with the confident manner of a man who had never yet encountered a problem that money could not navigate around. He operated a large, consolidated mining concern out of the county seat, and he had political connections that made the sheriff cooperative and the courts slow. He had wanted Mamie Conley's claim from the moment he had done his own geological assessment, and understood that her section sat directly above the richest vein in the entire Caldwell Flat district. He had made her an offer 18 months before Paul ever arrived. She had declined. He had made another offer. She had declined again, more firmly, with language that suggested she was not a woman who appreciated having the same argument twice. After that, Decker had apparently decided to take a different approach. Paul had found it in the filing cross-references, the kind of buried inconsistency that only a careful and experienced records man would recognize. Mamie's original claim registration, filed by Cole Conley in 1879, had a documentation number that appeared in the county records. But in a secondary registration index that Decker's people had apparently submitted to the Territorial Land Office in Carson City, that same documentation number was linked to a fraudulent affidavit that cast doubt on the original filing's validity. It was not a crude forgery. It was the kind of precise, patient corruption that required someone with inside knowledge of how the filing system worked. Paul had sat at his counter for 3 days with the evidence spread before him, understanding what it meant and what it would mean to report it, because Decker's connections ran directly through the county assessor's superior in Elko, and the previous holder of Paul's position had been pressured into early retirement when he had attempted to challenge one of Decker's earlier acquisitions. He had been afraid. He had told himself he needed more evidence. He had told himself he was waiting for the right moment. He had filed the documents carefully and watched Mamie work from across the boundary line and said nothing. 8 months of nothing. And now she was sitting at her kitchen table with the shotgun laid across her knees and a court document in her hand that said she had 30 days to vacate her claim. And Paul Morgan was across the table from her with a cup of coffee she had poured with the automatic hospitality of a woman raised in Missouri, and he was telling her everything. Her cabin was small but ordered in a way that spoke of someone who had made a deliberate and considered home out of limited materials. There was a proper stove, a table with 2 chairs, a narrow iron bedstead in the back corner, shelves with carefully arranged provisions and 3 books, and a framed photograph of a man who must have been Cole Conley looking serious and young. The whole place smelled of coffee and pine resin, and something faintly floral that Paul eventually identified as the dried lavender she had hung in a bundle from one of the ceiling beams. He told her about the fraudulent filing. He told her about the secondary index. He told her about Decker's likely contact at the Territorial Land Office. He told her about the previous assessor's removal. He told her about his own 8 months of waiting and why it had been wrong and what it had cost her. She listened to all of it without interrupting, which was more frightening than if she had been angry. When he finished, she set the court document flat on the table and put both hands over it, palm down, as though she was pressing something into the earth. "What can actually be done?" she said. "The original filing is legitimate," Paul said. "I have the genuine records. I also have the cross-reference documentation that shows the secondary filing is fraudulent. If we can get those materials to a territorial judge who isn't in Decker's pocket, we have a real case. The problem is that Decker has a 30-day head start on the legal timeline, and he knows this territory's legal mechanisms better than any of us do. Who isn't in his pocket? Judge Ellis Farrow in Reno. He's a federal appointee. Decker's influence runs through the territorial system, not the federal bench. Mamie looked at him steadily. Reno is 4 days' ride, 3.5 if the weather cooperates. And Decker will know immediately that I'm attempting to contest the document. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the sage, and August the mule made a sound of mild complaint from the small lean-to stable beside the cabin. The lamp on the table threw steady yellow light across the court document and across Mamie's hands and across Paul's face, and the shadows in the corners of the room were very still. "Why are you here?" she said. "Now, after 8 months." The question landed with the precision of a rifle shot. Paul did not look away. "Because I watched Decker's man ride away from your claim this morning," he said, "and I realized I had run out of excuses to be a coward, and that if I didn't come over and knock on your door tonight, I would spend the rest of my life being the man who stood by while someone extraordinary lost everything, and I don't know how to live with being that man." The word extraordinary sat between them in the lamplight. Mamie looked at him for a long, measuring moment. Then she stood up from the table and went to the stove and refilled her coffee cup and stood with her back to him for a moment longer than was necessary. "All right," she said when she turned around. "Then you had better be worth something. Because I need a person who understands the filing system, who can ride to Reno, and who can testify in front of a federal judge to what he knows about those records. Can you do that?" "Yes," Paul said, without hesitation, which was the first unhesitating thing he had done in 8 months. "Then go home and pack what you need," she said. "We leave at 4 in the morning." He stood up from the table and picked up his hat from the chair beside him. He was at the door before she spoke again. "Paul," it was the first time she had used his given name. It moved through him like a current. "Yes. If you disappear in the night because you've decided this is too dangerous after all," she said, "I will find you, and the shotgun will not be a threat when I do. It will be a conclusion." He almost smiled. It seemed wildly inappropriate and also completely inevitable. "I'll be at your gate at 4, he said. He was there at 3:45. They rode out of Caldwell Flat in the dark, Mamie on her mare Rosie and Paul on his gray gelding Dutch, with Paul's saddlebag containing the original claim documentation in an oilskin wrapping, and both of them carrying everything necessary for a hard journey. The October desert was cold before dawn, cold enough to see breath, and the stars were extraordinary in the way the Nevada desert stars always were, which was to say they were almost too numerous to comprehend. They did not talk much in that first pre-dawn hour. Paul rode slightly behind and to the right of Mamie, watching the terrain they were crossing and also watching her, and trying to understand how it was that he had spent 2 years living 40 feet from this woman, and managed to learn so little about who she actually was as opposed to who she appeared to be from a distance. She rode the way she did everything else, with a practical competence that had no performance in it. She read the trail in the lamplight they carried with a confidence that suggested she had ridden it before. She carried the Henry rifle across her saddlebow with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who was neither frightened of it nor eager to use it. "You've ridden this route before," he said when the sky began to light. "Twice," she said. "Once when Cole and I first came to the claim, once when he died and I went to register the claim in my own name." A pause, both difficult journeys. "I'm sorry about your husband," Paul said. Mamie was quiet for a beat. "Cole was a good man," she said. "He was not strong, but he was good. He believed in the claim. He believed we would make something real out there." She kept her eyes on the trail. "I intend to prove him right." "You have made something real out there," Paul said, and he meant it with a directness he had not planned, because the ledger records alone told the story of what Mamie Conley had done with a half-worked claim and no help in 2 Nevada winters. "The production figures from your section are the most consistent in the entire Caldwell Flat district." She glanced at him sideways. "You know my production figures. I'm the county assessor. I know everyone's production figures." "That's a strange kind of knowledge to have about a person," she said. "It's strange work," he agreed. But it's honest. Numbers don't lie, generally. People do the lying. Numbers just record what actually happened. Mamie considered this. I like that, she said. That's an honest thing to say. They made decent time through the morning, crossing the first ridge and descending into a long valley that the old route charts called Antelope Draw, though Paul had not seen an antelope in it yet. Around mid-morning, they stopped at a spring to water the horses and eat some of the provisions Mamie had packed, which were considerably better than what Paul would have assembled on his own. She had dried beef, real bread from somewhere, dried apricots, and coffee that she made on a small fire in a tin pot with the efficiency of long practice. They sat on opposite sides of the fire and Paul studied the maps he had brought while Mamie checked Rosie's left rear shoe, which had been making a sound that concerned her. She found a small stone worked into the shoe, dislodged it with a hoof pick, and declared the horse sound, all within the time it took Paul to identify their position on the map. You know horses, he said. I know what's necessary, she said, which was becoming something he recognized as her characteristic answer to any observation about her competence. Mamie, he set the map down. I need to tell you something else about Decker. She came back to the fire and sat down across from him. Her hat was pushed back and the mid-morning light was on her face, and she looked at him with those direct, dark eyes and waited. He's been buying up claims specifically in the section above the main vein, Paul said. I've been tracking it in the filing records. Your claim is the last significant section above that vein that isn't his. Once he takes it, he'll control the entire productive run of ore from the ridgeline to the mill road. It won't just be your mine. It'll be the consolidation of the whole district under his control. That means he'll also control the rates, Mamie said immediately. Yes. Every independent miner left in the district will either pay Decker's price to process through his mill or abandon their claim. The economic independence of the whole settlement goes with my claim. She had said my claim without thinking, and then she caught it, and her expression shifted with a fractional tightening around her eyes. I noticed something, Paul said carefully, when I was reviewing the filings this morning before we left. There's one other person who might be affected enough to testify on your behalf. Who? A man named Terrence Webb. He has a medium-sized claim on the southern edge of the productive zone. He's been resisting Decker's offers for 2 years. If Decker gets your section, Webb's claim becomes economically unworkable because of the water rights that run through your property. Webb doesn't know about Decker's filings, but he knows he's being slowly cornered. He's an honest man. He testified in the Harker case 2 years ago. He might come to Reno. Mamie was looking at him with an expression that was harder to read than her usual direct clarity. You've been thinking about my situation for quite some time, she said. I have, Paul said. He held her gaze. Longer than I reported, and I'm sorry for that. A silence opened between them that was different in quality from the earlier ones, charged with something that was not quite anger and not quite anything else Paul had clear vocabulary for. What made you finally come? She asked. And I mean the real reason, not the one about not wanting to be the man who stood by. Paul picked up his coffee cup and looked into it. This morning, before Decker's man arrived, I was watching you from my doorstep, he said. You were walking to the mine shaft. You had your tools over your shoulder, and you were looking up at the ridgeline the way you do sometimes, like you're calculating something private. And I thought, I have watched this woman calculate impossible things for 2 years, and I have never once found the courage to walk over there and ask her how she does it. And that seemed, suddenly, like the most wasteful thing a person could do with 2 years. Mamie looked at him for a long time. That is either a very honest thing to say, she finally said, or a very sophisticated lie. I don't have the imagination for sophisticated lying, Paul said. I'm an assessor. I count things. Something shifted in her expression then. It was subtle and it was brief, and he almost missed it, but he thought it might have been the beginning of something that was not entirely unfriendly. They rode through the afternoon and made camp that night in a rocky overhang that Mamie knew from her previous journey, a natural shelter that protected against the wind, without requiring them to build a structure. Paul tended the horses while Mamie made a second fire and cooked a simple meal from their provisions. And they ate with the enormous Nevada sky above them going from deep blue to the specific darkness of rural desert night, where you could see the Milky Way as a physical river of light. "Can I ask you something personal?" Paul said, after they had been sitting quietly long enough that the question felt natural rather than intrusive. "You can ask. The photograph in your cabin. Of Cole, you keep it on the shelf where you can see it from the table." "Yes." "Do you miss him very much still?" Mamie was quiet for a moment, and he understood he might have overstepped, but she answered. "I miss who we were going to be," she said. "Cole and I came west with a plan, a whole future built around that claim and what we would make of it. When he died, I grieved him, but I also grieved the plan, the version of my life that had a partner in it." She poked at the fire with a stick. "I've been building a different version since then, one that doesn't require a partner. It's harder in some ways, but it's mine." "You've done it well," Paul said, and he meant it with a depth that he understood was probably more visible on his face than was strategic. Mamie looked at him across the fire, and whatever she saw in his expression made her look away, not unkindly, but with the deliberate manner of a person who is being careful with something fragile. "Go to sleep, Paul Morgan," she said. "We ride at first light." He wrapped himself in his blanket and lay with the stars above him, and understood that he was completely and helplessly in love with a woman who had every rational reason not to trust him, and that he would simply have to do better until she had reason enough. They made good time on the second day, the weather staying clear and the trail dry. Around midday they passed through a small way-station settlement called Pico Cross, which had a water trough and a general store, and not much else, but where Paul stopped to send a telegraph message to Judge Farrow's clerk in Reno, announcing their intention to seek an emergency hearing on a territorial land fraud matter. The telegraph operator, a thin young man with ink-stained fingers, looked at the message with the particular expression of someone who recognized significant names, and Paul watched him with a careful attention that paid off when the young man glanced toward the far end of the counter where a second man, heavier, with a badge that indicated some vague official capacity, was watching with visible interest. Paul went back to where Mamie was watering the horses. "Decker has eyes here," he said quietly. Mamie did not turn her head or change her expression, which told him she had already noticed. "I know, saw him when we rode in. He'll send word ahead. I know that too." She checked the cinch on Rosie's saddle with a practiced pull. "How close to Reno are we? If we push this afternoon, we can make the evening stage road and be in Reno by tomorrow noon." "Then we push," she said. They pushed. The horses were good, Mamie's Rosie in particular demonstrating the specific tenacity of a mare that has been well cared for and understands her rider. Paul's Dutch kept pace with a solid, ground-eating trot that he was pleased about, because Dutch was the one thing in his life that he had judged correctly on first assessment. They made the stage road with an hour of light left and joined the wheel-rutted main corridor south toward Reno, and the increased traffic made them anonymous in a way that Paul found deeply reassuring. Mamie relaxed fractionally with the company of other riders and wagons around them, her hand moving away from the rifle stock where it had rested all afternoon. "You keep your hand on that rifle like a natural," Paul observed. "Cole taught me," she said. "He was a good shot, whatever else." She paused. "I'm better," he laughed. He had not expected to laugh, and it came out with a kind of relief that surprised them both. Mamie looked at him with that almost expression again, and this time it held just a moment longer before she looked back at the road, and Paul thought that it might actually be the beginning of a smile. They reached a way-station inn on the stage road by dark, and Paul insisted on paying for a proper room for each of them, which Mamie accepted with a brief argument that he won on the grounds that he had cost her 8 months of strategic advantage, and the least he could do was pay for a bed. She conceded the point with the specific grace of someone who knows the argument is correct and does not waste time on ones that are not. He was up before her in the morning, which surprised him, because he had expected Mamie to be constitutionally early. He had the horses saddled and a breakfast of eggs and bread arranged on the inn's common table when she came out in the blue-gray light of pre-dawn, and she stopped in the doorway of the inn and looked at the arranged table and the saddled horses beyond with an expression that flickered through something complex and then settled into something quieter. "You didn't need to do that," she said. "I know," he said. She sat down and ate the eggs without further comment, but there was a quality to the silence at the table that was different from the silences before, and Paul ate his own breakfast with something moving in his chest that was partly hope and partly terror, and entirely outside his previous experience of either. Reno in the fall of 1882 was a real city by Nevada standards, with brick buildings and a proper courthouse and hotels that had glass windows and carpeted lobbies. They rode in around 11 in the morning, finding it immediately more organized and more complicated than Caldwell Flat, and Mamie looked at it with the slightly wary attention of someone whose long acquaintance with open desert makes cities feel pressurized. Judge Ellis Farrow's clerk, a sharp young man named Adkins, received them in the anteroom of the federal court offices and confirmed that their telegraph had arrived and that Judge Farrow was aware of the matter and could hear them that afternoon. The clerk examined Paul's documentation with the professional focus of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at, and when he finished, he set it carefully on his desk and looked at Mamie. "Mrs. Conley," he said, "I want to be straightforward with you. We've had 2 other matters involving Harlan Decker's land acquisitions come to this office in the past year. Both were withdrawn before hearing." "Withdrawn under pressure," Mamie said. "It was not a question." "I can't speak to the reasons," Adkins said carefully. "I can tell you that the judge would be interested in proceeding if you intend to proceed." "I intend to proceed," Mamie said. Paul watched the clerk look at her with the same evaluating attention that everyone eventually applied to Mamie Conley, and saw him reach the same conclusion that Paul himself had reached, which was that this was not a woman who made statements she did not mean. Judge Farrow was 60 years old, a former military man with a white beard and the particular stillness of someone who has spent decades making decisions that matter. He received them in his chambers at 3 in the afternoon, examined Paul's documentation with methodical care for 40 minutes, asked a series of precise and well-constructed questions, and then leaned back in his chair and addressed them both. "The documentary evidence of filing fraud is substantial," he said. "Mr. Morgan's professional testimony as to the original record's validity and the fraudulent secondary index is critical to the case. What I need in addition is a witness who can speak to the pattern of acquisition pressure, someone who has direct experience of Decker's coercive methods." "Terrence Webb," Paul said. "A claim holder in the Caldwell Flat district who has resisted Decker's offers and whose water rights are directly linked to Mrs. Conley's claim. He'd have standing and he'd have knowledge. Can you produce him within the hearing timeline?" Paul looked at Mamie. Mamie looked at Paul. The unspoken conversation lasted about 3 seconds. "Give me a week," Paul said. "I'll go back and bring Webb personally. I'll write the letters you'll need to protect the claim in the interim," Judge Farrow said, reaching for his pen. "Decker will know you've been here within 48 hours if he doesn't know already. He may attempt to accelerate the eviction. Mrs. Conley, I would recommend you return to your property with the interim order in hand and present it to the local sheriff." "With respect, Judge," Mamie said, "the local sheriff in Caldwell Flat is not an independent actor in this situation." Judge Farrow looked at her over his writing. "No," he said, "I imagine he is not." He finished writing. "Then take a copy of this order with you and telegraph the federal marshal's office in Elko. That's a direct line this office has authority over." He handed the document to Paul. "Mr. Morgan, I'll need you in this room in 1 week with Mr. Webb or documentation I can use in his absence. Mrs. Conley, do not leave your property once you return to it. Hold the line." "That," said Mamie Conley, "is the only thing I know how to do." They spent one night in Reno before riding back. Mamie went to bed early and Paul sat in the hotel's small lobby writing letters. one to the federal marshal's office and one to Terrence Webb, and one, which he wrote and then reconsidered, and then rewrote 3 times, to his superior at the county assessor's office in Elko, laying out formally and completely what he knew about the filing fraud and his role in failing to report it immediately. It was the most uncomfortable letter he had ever written, but it was also the most necessary, and when he sealed it, he felt something loosen in his chest that had been constricted for 8 months. He slept better than he had in some time. In the morning, over breakfast in the hotel's dining room, which was a proper affair with white tablecloths and coffee served in china cups, Mamie said, without preamble, "Last night you said you've been watching me for 2 years." Paul set down his coffee cup. "I said I had been watching you calculate things," he said, "from across the property line." "From across the property line," she repeated, with a dryness that suggested she found this distinction both true and somewhat insufficient. "I want to be accurate," he said. "I was watching because I found you genuinely interesting, and I didn't know how to say so without sounding inappropriate. And then the longer I didn't say so, the more impossible it seemed to start. And so I continued in a state of silence that was both cowardly and ultimately harmful to you, which I have already admitted and apologized for." Mamie was looking at him with an expression that he was beginning to recognize as her evaluation face, the expression she wore when she was taking in information and deciding what to do with it. It was a good face. He found it beautiful in the specific way that sincere things are beautiful. "You are a very honest man when you actually speak," she said. "I try to be. And yet you spent 8 months not speaking." "Yes, that is a significant contradiction," she said. "I know." She looked at him for another moment. Then she picked up her coffee cup and looked out the window at the Reno street where the morning traffic was beginning to move. "I noticed you too," she said to the window. "In the beginning, when you first arrived and you walked your property line and you said you hadn't been planning to cross it." A pause. "I thought about that for 3 days. I'm not sure why." Paul was very still. "Then I decided it was not a useful thing to think about," she continued, "and I put it away. Because I had work to do and a claim to run, and I was not in a position to be distracted by a quiet man with careful eyes who was going to be in that office for a few years and then leave." "I'm not planning to leave," Paul said. Mamie looked at him. "I know that now," she said. And she drank her coffee, and the moment settled around them like a held breath, and Paul understood that whatever was happening between them was not yet anything he could name, but it was real, and it was growing, and it was worth every hard mile they still had in front of them. The ride back was faster, partly because they knew the road now, and partly because the urgency of the situation drove them. They spoke more freely as the miles passed, the conversation opening up in the way that shared difficulty tends to open people who might otherwise remain closed. Paul talked about Ohio and Cincinnati and the broken engagement. A woman named Clara who had been perfectly reasonable and perfectly unsuitable in ways that had taken him too long to recognize. Mamie talked about Missouri and the decision to come west with Cole, and what it had felt like to stand at the edge of the territory for the first time and understand that she was as far from everything familiar as she had ever been. "Were you afraid?" Paul asked. "Of course," she said, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone for whom fear is a known quantity rather than a secret. "Fear is just information. It tells you what matters. You use it and you keep moving." They arrived back in Caldwell Flat on the afternoon of the 4th day to find that Decker had not yet made a physical move on the property. Whether because of legal caution or simple strategic calculation, Paul couldn't be certain. The interim order from Judge Farrow was immediately valuable, and Paul spent the evening at the telegraph office sending the message to the federal marshal in Elko. The sheriff, a man named Grover Hobbs who had the look of someone who had made several accommodations with his conscience over the years, came by Mamie's claim the following morning, and Mamie met him at the gate with the court document in her hand, and the shotgun visible but not raised, and Paul standing behind her left shoulder, in a position that he hoped communicated solidarity without belligerence. Hobbs read the document twice, which suggested either that he was a slow reader or that he was looking for an escape hatch that wasn't there. He found none. He told them Decker's lawyers had already filed a response and that things would proceed through the proper channels. He was looking at Paul when he said it, and his expression contained a specific message, which was that proper channels in Caldwell Flat had historically bent in a particular direction. "The federal marshal's office has been notified," Paul said, "as a matter of record." Hobbs' jaw worked for a moment. "Right," he said, and left. Mamie turned and looked at Paul. "Nicely done," she said. The next several days were tense in the way that a period of enforced waiting is always tense, which is to say the tension had no outlet, and therefore built against the walls of ordinary daily activity like water against a dam. Paul continued his work at the assessor's office, moving carefully through the filing records and making additional documentation copies of every relevant record that might be needed for the hearing. He sent the difficult letter to Elko and received back an acknowledgment that was non-committal in its language, but which suggested the superior had read it carefully. He went to see Terrence Webb on the second day back, riding the 3 miles to Webb's claim in the early morning and making the case as directly as he could. Webb was a weathered man of 55 with the suspicious good sense of someone who has been lied to a specific number of times and has calibrated his trust accordingly. He listened to Paul's explanation of the situation and the water rights connection without speaking, and then he asked 3 precise and well-chosen questions about the documentation, and then he said he would think about it. Paul came back the next morning and Webb said yes. Meanwhile, across the property line, Mamie worked her claim with the same systematic regularity as always, and Paul was close enough now that he could see the details he had previously only watched from a distance: the specific way she marked the ore samples before sending them to the mill, the small weather journal she kept on the cabin's porch table, the way August the mule followed her around the property with the devoted attention of a large and impractical dog. On the 3rd evening, she came to his door. He opened it before she could knock because he had seen her coming across the boundary line from his window and he had not wanted her to wait, and the unexpectedness of the open door seemed to briefly disrupt her composure, which was something that was genuinely rare. "I brought you something," she said, and held out a jar of preserves. "Peach. The woman at the dry goods store makes them. I had an extra jar." He took the jar. "Thank you." She stood in his doorway for a moment, looking at his cabin with the mild curiosity of someone seeing a familiar exterior for the first time from the inside angle. His cabin was considerably less orderly than hers, books stacked on every available surface and papers organized in a system that only made sense to him, but it was not dirty, and the stove was going and the lamplight was warm. "You have a lot of books," she said. "Most are about land management and territorial law," he said, "but some are for reading." "Which ones?" He pointed to the shelf that held his genuine reading books: the Thoreau, a volume of George Eliot, a collection of recent Harper's Weekly issues, and slightly embarrassingly, a copy of a poetry anthology that his mother had sent him the previous Christmas. Mamie stepped inside, uninvited but not unwelcome, and looked at the shelf. She pulled out the George Eliot. "Middlemark," she said, "I've read this." "You have?" He was unreasonably delighted. "Cole brought it west," she said. "I read it twice. I think Dorothea makes a mistake with Casaubon, but I understand why she makes it." She put the book back. "She wants to be useful to something larger than herself. She just misjudges what that thing is." "She eventually finds it," Paul said. "Yes," Mamie said, "she does." She turned from the shelf and looked at him in the lamplight of his cabin, and they were much closer than they had ever been, which had happened by the simple arithmetic of the space being small. "I need to ask you something." "Ask." "After the hearing, after whatever happens with Decker, are you planning to stay in Caldwell Flat?" "Yes," he said without hesitation, the same way he had said it in the Reno hotel. "Why?" He looked at her. "Because the work is real and it matters." And because the place has become home in a way I didn't expect." He paused. "And because there's a person here that I've been wasting 2 years not talking to, and I'd rather not waste any more." The lamp threw their shadows against the cabin wall, overlapping. Mamie looked at him for a long moment, and he could see something working in her, some internal calculation or assessment, the kind he had watched her apply to everything from ore samples to legal documents. "I should go back," she said. "Early morning." "Yes," he said. She moved toward the door and he stepped back to make room, and their arms brushed in the small space, barely a touch. A moment of contact that lasted less than a second and registered in Paul's chest as something considerably larger. At the door she stopped without turning around. "I think," she said carefully to the doorframe, "that I might not have put you away as thoroughly as I thought I had." Then she went back across the boundary line in the dark, and Paul Morgan stood in his doorway and watched her go and understood that he was the luckiest coward in Nevada. They rode to Reno the following day with Terrence Webb, the three of them making a larger and more deliberate party, and they arrived at Judge Farrow's court to find that Decker had indeed sent his own legal representation, a pair of lawyers from Carson City, with an argument that was sophisticated and well-prepared and based on the fraudulent documentation, with a confidence that suggested they believed the fraud to be undetectable. It was not undetectable to Paul Morgan, who had spent the past several days making absolutely sure he could demonstrate every element of the discrepancy in clear, methodical terms that a court could follow. The hearing lasted most of the day. Paul testified for 2 hours about the filing records, walking the judge through the documentation with the systematic clarity of a man who had spent his professional life making numbers tell true stories. Terrence Webb testified about Decker's acquisition methods and the specific pressure that had been applied to him and several other claim holders in the district. Mamie sat at the table beside the lawyer that Judge Farrow's clerk had arranged for her, a young man named Henley who was less experienced than Decker's lawyers, but who had clearly prepared carefully and who asked exactly the right questions. Decker's lawyers were good, but they were building a case on fraudulent foundations, which has the structural disadvantage of everything built on false ground, which is that the more weight you put on it, the faster it fails. By the time Paul had finished his testimony and submitted the documentary evidence, even the most generous legal reading could not sustain the secondary filing's legitimacy. Judge Farrow took a brief recess and returned with the decision that the secondary filing was fraudulent and void, that the original Conley claim registration was valid and in full legal standing, and that the 30-day eviction notice was without legal force. He also noted for the record that the documentation presented suggested a pattern of misconduct warranting investigation by the appropriate territorial authorities, and that he would be referring the matter. It was not a dramatic verdict in the way of legal decisions. It was delivered in measured legal language and recorded in official terms. But Mamie Conley, sitting beside her young lawyer with her back very straight and her hands folded on the table, went very still when the judge finished speaking, and then she closed her eyes for a moment, just a moment, in a way that Paul recognized as the specific stillness of a person absorbing something they have worked very hard for. He wanted, with a sudden fierce clarity, to take her hand. He did not, because they were in a federal courtroom and she had not invited it, but the wanting was the most honest thing he had felt in years. They celebrated, such as it was, over dinner in Reno, the three of them at the hotel restaurant, where Terrence Webb proved to be a man of unexpected humor once relieved of a significant amount of anxiety, and where Mamie drank 1 glass of wine with the careful appreciation of someone who did not waste good things. Webb retired early, and Paul and Mamie remained at the table as the restaurant thinned around them. "What happens now?" Paul asked. "I go back and work my claim," Mamie said. "Same as before." "Decker isn't finished," Paul said. He said it carefully, not wanting to diminish the victory but also not willing to let her walk back into danger without all the information. The referral for investigation helps, but a man like that doesn't change direction easily. He still wants that section. I know, she said, but now he knows I fight back, and that I have resources he didn't expect. She looked at Paul across the table. That I have people. The word people in her mouth in that context, in that light, meant something specific that he understood perfectly. Mamie, he said. Paul, she said, with a deliberateness that suggested she was choosing to use his name for a reason. When we get back, he said, and when things have settled, yes, she said. He blinked. I hadn't finished. I know, she said, but I have thought about where you were going, and the answer is yes. He looked at her across the white tablecloth and the candle and the half-empty wine glasses. This woman who had survived so much with such extraordinary self-sufficiency, who had aimed a shotgun at him and poured him coffee and ridden 4 days across the desert and won her case and read Middlemark twice, and knew which part of her horse's shoe was making a sound and how to calibrate fear as information. I had a whole speech prepared, he said. Tell me later, she said. Tell me when it matters more. He understood what she meant. Later, in the Caldwell Flat desert beside her claim, in the quiet of a morning or an evening when the emergency was behind them and there was no tactical reason for tenderness, when whatever she extended toward him would be entirely uncomplicated by gratitude or relief or the survival logic of the past 2 weeks. She wanted it to be clean. She wanted it to be real. He nodded. Later, he said. It took another 3 weeks for Caldwell Flat to settle, not into peace exactly, but into a new arrangement of forces. Decker's lawyers attempted a second filing challenge that Farrow's decision foreclosed. The territorial investigation into the filing fraud moved slowly but moved, with Paul's documentation forming its evidentiary spine. The county assessor's office in Elko sent a formal response to Paul's confession letter that was cautionary in tone, but which, reading between its lines, suggested that the superior was not entirely sorry to have an honest record in hand, and that Paul's position was not in immediate jeopardy. Sheriff Hobbs' relationship with Decker's interest became notably less visible in the subsequent weeks, which Paul attributed to the federal marshal's presence at 2 meetings of which he was aware. He did not know what was said at those meetings, but Hobbs began appearing at his office reliably for the first time in Paul's experience. Webb went back to his claim and sent a brief note 2 weeks later saying that Decker's representative had not visited him since the hearing. Decker himself never appeared directly in Caldwell Flat, which was consistent with what Paul had come to understand about the man, who operated through intermediaries and documentation and legal mechanisms rather than personal confrontation. That distance, Paul thought, was ultimately also his weakness. He had underestimated Mamie Conley because he had never had to sit across a table from her. In November, on a morning after the first real snow had dusted the ridgeline, Paul walked to the boundary marker between their properties and stood there, where he had stood 40 feet from her door for 2 years, and looked at the cabin. Smoke was coming from the chimney. August was visible behind the fence, his mule ears pricked forward in the cold air. He walked to the door and knocked. Mamie opened it immediately, which suggested she had seen him coming, and she was in her work clothes with her hair loose because it was early and she had not yet put it up, and the lamplight from the cabin was warm behind her, and she looked at him with those dark eyes and an expression that was open in a way he had not seen before. "You knocked," she said. "I knocked," he said. "About time," she said, and stepped back to let him in. He stepped across her threshold for the second time, but it felt nothing like the first, because the first had been an emergency and this was a choice, made in the cold November air with no tactical necessity behind it, just 2 people and a door in the morning. She made coffee and they sat at the kitchen table, and Paul told her the speech he had been preparing, which was not quite as organized as he had intended, because being in the same small room as Mamie Conley apparently disrupted his capacity for linear presentation. He told her that he had loved her since that first October afternoon when she had told him, "The property line was right there, and don't cross it," which was the most clarifying thing anyone had ever said to him. He told her that he was aware he had not been brave about it, and that he intended to be braver from here forward. He told her that he was not going anywhere, not because of the job or the property, but because of her, and that he understood it was her choice entirely what to do with any of that. He stopped talking and picked up his coffee cup to do something with his hands. Mamie had been listening with her elbows on the table and her coffee cup in front of her and her hair loose around her shoulders. When he stopped, she was quiet for a moment. "I have been alone for 4 years," she said. "Not counting the time Cole was sick, which was a different kind of alone. 4 years of being entirely responsible for myself, every decision, every consequence, every morning. And I got very good at it, and I'm proud of that, but I'm also," she paused, choosing, "tired in a specific way that has nothing to do with the work and everything to do with not having anyone who actually knows me." She looked at him. "You know me, Paul. You know my production figures, which sounds ridiculous, but you also know that I name my mule and read George Eliot and keep a weather journal and I use fear as information. You know those things because you paid attention when you had no reason to and no invitation to." "I had reason," he said. "I just kept it to myself." "You did," she agreed. "And you should not have, and we have already settled that." A pause. "But here you are, and here I am. And I am not 20 years old, and I have enough sense to know when something is real." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "It is real," she said quietly. The moment sat between them like a held note in music, perfectly still and resonant. Paul turned his hand under hers and held it, and Mamie Conley, who did not waste things, who used fear as information and calculated the impossible with systematic grace, let him. Outside, August made his loud and undignified mule sound that served as his opinion on most of the universe's developments. The fire crackled in the stove. The first snowlight of November came through the cabin's single window and lay across the table. They stayed there, talking, for the rest of the morning, and it was the first morning in 2 years that either of them had not spent entirely alone. What followed was not simple, because neither of them were simple people and the world around them was not simple either. But it was genuine, which turned out to be worth considerably more than simple. They began with a cautious, deliberate approach that suited both their temperaments, which was essentially to continue being themselves while allowing the other person to be present for it. Paul spent more time on her side of the boundary line. Mamie spent occasional evenings in his cabin, borrowing books and returning them with brief, precise assessments that he found more valuable than any review he had ever read professionally. She liked Hardy and distrusted Dickens, which she explained on the grounds that Dickens' good women were too good, and his bad women were too bad, and real women were considerably more complicated than either. Paul agreed with a sincerity that made her look at him sharply, and then apparently decide he meant it. He helped her reinforce the mine shaft supports in December, when a wet storm put pressure on the upper section. She helped him reorganize the assessor's office filing system in January, when his method of dealing with the accumulated disorder of his predecessor's records had reached an impasse that she solved in an afternoon with a ruthless logic that left him slightly awed. He cooked dinner at his cabin on Thursday evenings, and she brought the bread because his bread was not good, which he admitted without defensiveness, and she found this admission more appealing than false confidence would have been. He kissed her for the first time in February, on a cold evening after dinner at his cabin when she was putting on her coat to go home across the snow-covered boundary line. And it was not a dramatic or strategically executed moment, but simply the natural result of standing very close together in a warm room and both of them knowing, without any further ambiguity, that they were in love. She kissed him back with the same direct completeness with which she did everything else, and then she pulled back and looked at him with those dark eyes and said, "You should have done that at least 4 months ago." "I know," he said. "We need to work on your timing," she said, and went home. He stood in his doorway in the February cold, grinning at the dark, and August, visible in his stable across the boundary line, regarded him with mule skepticism. In March, with the Decker investigation having produced formal charges against 2 of his associates and a complete unraveling of the fraudulent secondary filing system that had been used across multiple claims in the district, Terrence Webb came to Paul's office to make a formal statement for the record and spent a while afterward looking at Paul with an expression that contained fatherly amusement. "She's a remarkable woman," Webb said. "I know," Paul said. "You are the least dramatic courting man I have ever observed," Webb said, "but you are thorough, I'll give you that." In April, the territorial attorney's investigation produced a complete exposure of the filing fraud network, including the contact at the land office in Carson City who had been Decker's inside mechanism. Decker himself avoided criminal charges through the exercise of his substantial legal resources, but he was formally censured. The fraudulent filings were completely voided, and his ability to operate within the Caldwell Flat district was effectively destroyed. He relocated his mining concerns to a different county, and Caldwell Flat went back to being a settlement of independent claim holders, which was what it had been before his patience and capital had started reshaping it. The last of the spring snow was melting off the ridgeline when Paul Morgan walked to Mamie's cabin in the early evening with something in his coat pocket, and a degree of nervousness that he had not experienced since the night he first knocked on her door, which he now understood had been good practice for the terror of the genuinely important moments. She was on the porch with her weather journal when he came across the boundary line, and she looked up and then looked at his face and closed the journal. "Whatever that expression means," she said, "you should probably say what you came to say." He came up onto the porch and stood in front of her, this woman who had aimed a shotgun at him and poured him coffee and ridden 4 days through the desert, and held her line and read Middlemark twice, and put her hand over his on the kitchen table and told him it was real. He took the ring out of his pocket. It was a simple thing, gold with a small turquoise stone, which was what a careful man of moderate means could provide, and which he had chosen because the turquoise was the exact color of the Nevada sky on the clear mornings when he had watched her walk to her mine, before he had the nerve to do anything about what he felt. "Mamie," he said. "Paul," she said, with the deliberateness that meant she was choosing it. "I lived next door to you for 2 years before I found the nerve to knock on your door," he said. "And in the months since then I have been trying to make up for those 2 years as best I can. I am not a dramatic man and I am not always brave when I ought to be, but I am thorough and I am honest and I love you with the entirety of what I am, which is not nothing, even if it is also not everything I wish it were." "Paul," she said. "Let me finish," he said, her mouth curved. "Go on. I would like to spend every remaining morning of my life on the same side of the boundary line as you," he said, "as your husband. If you want that." Mamie Conley looked at the ring and then at his face, and whatever she was calculating in that evaluation look, the one he had come to know as the face she made when she was taking in information and deciding what to do with it, it appeared to resolve quickly. "Yes," she said, for the second time, because Mamie did not waste words on long answers when a single honest one would serve. He put the ring on her finger. She looked at it with the same focused attention she gave to ore samples and court documents, and then she looked up at him, and he saw in her face something that he had never seen there before, not the composure or the calculation or the directed competence, but something unguarded and warm and entirely her own. And he understood that this was the version of Mamie Conley that 2 years of distance and silence had hidden from him. The one that existed underneath the self-sufficiency and the shotgun and the weather journal, and that he was the only person in the world who was going to get to see it every day. He kissed her again on the porch in the April evening, with August watching from the fence with his long mule ears pricked forward, and the smell of sage and snowmelt, and the faint mineral bite of silver ore that had scented every day of their strange beginning. They married in June of 1883 in the small Caldwell Flat church that doubled as a schoolroom on weekdays, with Terence Webb standing as witness, and the dry goods store proprietor's wife crying in the first pew with the warm efficiency of someone who had been waiting for this development since October of 1882 and was frankly relieved it had finally arrived. The sheriff attended, Hobbs, looking somewhat reformed, which Paul was charitable enough to attribute to the federal marshal's influence rather than any particular improvement in character. Judge Farrow sent a letter that Mamie read twice before folding and keeping in the back of her weather journal. The minister performed the service with a straightforward reverence that neither Paul nor Mamie had asked for, but which was appropriate to the weight of the occasion. And when he reached the place where Paul was supposed to put the ring on Mamie's finger, Mamie was already holding her hand out in the particular way of a person who has already made up her mind and is simply waiting for the formality to catch up with the decision. After the ceremony, at the celebration in the churchyard, Mamie stood with her husband's hand in hers and talked with the wives of two other claim holders and Terence Webb's eldest daughter, who had ridden over from the Webb claim for the occasion and who kept looking at Paul with the frank assessment of a young woman evaluating whether a man was worthy. Paul bore this inspection with good humor. That evening, in the cabin that was now theirs together, because they had made the practical decision that Mamie's cabin was the better-built structure, and Paul's would serve as an office and spare room, Paul stood at the window that looked out over the claim in the midsummer dusk and felt something settle in him that he realized he had been waiting his entire adult life to feel. Mamie came to stand beside him at the window. She had taken her hair down and she was still in her wedding dress, which was a sensible blue wool that she had ordered from the dry goods store 3 months ago and which she had mentioned, to also wear for other important occasions because she was not a woman who bought things twice. "Happy," she said. "Profoundly," he said. He put his arm around her and she leaned against his shoulder, and they looked out at the claim together, at the mine shaft entrance and the sluice channel and the little stable where August was making his evening sounds, and at the ridgeline above it, all turning gold and then amber in the last light. "I keep thinking," she said, "about those 2 years." "Don't," he said, not unkindly. "No, I mean," she paused, and he could hear her choosing the words with care the way she always did. "I think those 2 years were what they were. You were watching me and I knew it even though I pretended I didn't. And I let it happen because it was," another pause, "safe. Someone caring about you from a respectful distance is not a threat. It gave me room to be who I needed to be after Cole died." Paul looked at her. "And then when the threat came," she continued, "the actual threat, you came across the boundary line, even at cost to yourself." She looked up at him. Maybe the timing was exactly right. He thought about this with the honest consideration it deserved, which took a moment. "I think," he said carefully, "that I could have come sooner and it would have been fine, but I understand what you mean and I'm glad the result was what it was." "Good enough," she said. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. They worked the claim together in the years that followed, the partnership as practical as everything else they did, with Paul's administrative and legal knowledge complementing Mamie's operational expertise in ways that proved, once combined, to be considerably more effective than either separately. The claim's production increased in the second half of 1883, and through 1884, as Paul brought the accounting into a systematic clarity that allowed Mamie to make better decisions about where to invest labor and where to conserve it. Paul also continued his assessor's work, which he had quietly renegotiated to include a formal investigative component in the wake of the Decker affair, an outcome his superior in Elko had proposed with the particular political instinct of an administrator who recognizes an opportunity to turn an embarrassment into an institutional strength. Paul was good at the investigative work. He had a natural aptitude for finding the thing that did not quite line up, the number that did not belong, the document that was almost right but not quite, and the Decker case had given him the experience and the standing to pursue it without the hesitation that had cost everyone so much time. In the spring of 1884, Mamie told him she was expecting their first child, which she announced at breakfast with the same matter-of-fact directness she applied to everything, and he sat across the kitchen table from her and felt the particular joy that is not dramatic but simply deep and fills the whole room. "Are you frightened?" he asked, because he was a little, but he wanted to know about her. "Yes," she said and looked at him steadily. "But fear is just information. What does it tell you?" "That this matters," she said. Their son was born in November of 1884, a solid, loud child who arrived with considerable determination and was named Joseph Cole Morgan, the middle name for the man who had first believed in the claim, which Paul suggested himself, and Mamie accepted with the specific gratitude that goes very quiet because it is too large for ordinary expression. Joseph was 10 months old and already attempting to stand on the cabin's porch railing when the formal letter arrived from the territorial attorney's office confirming that the final stage of the Decker investigation had resulted in the recovery and voiding of all fraudulent claim filings in the district, and a formal restoration of full title to every affected claim holder, along with a modest restitution payment that Mamie looked at and then looked at Paul. "It's not very much," she said. "No," he agreed, "but it's real." She folded the letter and put it in her weather journal, which was now in its 3rd volume, beside Judge Farrow's letter. The following spring, when Joseph was learning to walk with the specific unstable determination of a person who has decided that this skill is the most important one currently available and will not be deterred by the repeated experience of falling down, Terrence Webb's eldest daughter married a young claim holder named Davis, who had recently arrived in the district. Paul and Mamie attended the wedding, and Mamie carried Joseph on her hip the entire reception with the ease of someone for whom this had become the most natural arrangement in the world. On the way home, walking in the warm May evening with Joseph asleep on Paul's shoulder, Mamie said, "I think we might need to consider expanding the cabin." Paul looked at her. "Before the question forms on your face," she said, "yes." He laughed, soft, so as not to wake Joseph, and then he took her hand in his free one, and they walked home through the Nevada spring with the ridgeline above the claim pale gold in the last light, and August watching their approach with the resigned affection of a mule, who has observed a great deal of human drama from the fence, and has reached his own conclusions about it. Their daughter was born in December of 1886, which completed the symmetry of a Nevada winter bookending their family as the first winter had bookended their beginning. They named her Eleanor, which was both Mamie's mother's name and the name of the George Eliot protagonist from a novel Paul had read 3 times by then. And Eleanor Morgan arrived with dark eyes exactly like her mother's, and immediately applied them to the world with what Paul could only describe as evaluation. "She looks at everything like you do," he told Mamie, 2 days after Eleanor arrived, when they were sitting at the kitchen table with the baby between them and Joseph asleep in his bed, and the winter dark outside very complete. Mamie looked at Eleanor with a warmth that Paul had now watched her grow into over the years with the specific satisfaction of watching something rare develop to its full capacity. "She's going to be difficult for any number of people," Mamie said, sounding profoundly proud. "Yes," Paul agreed, equally proud. He reached across the table, past Eleanor's small and extraordinary presence, and took Mamie's hand. She turned it and held his, the same gesture she had made at the kitchen table 3 years before, when she had told him it was real. It had only become more so. Outside, the Nevada winter pressed against the cabin's walls and the fire burned steadily in the stove, and the claim sat quiet under its light covering of snow, the mine shaft entrance still, the sluice channel waiting for spring, August in his stable making the soft sounds of a mule that has found his situation satisfactory. The assessor's office, 100 feet away across the old boundary line, held its filing cabinets in careful order, the records of a district that had fought for its independence and found it, and in the front cabinet in the file labeled Conley, Morgan, Joint Claim, 1883. The original registration documents from 1879 sat beside their authenticated copies with the territorial seal and the judge's ruling, and a brief formal note confirming what any person who had been present from the beginning already knew, that the claim had always been exactly what it said it was, and the woman who held it had been exactly who she appeared to be, and the man who had finally found the nerve to knock on her door was exactly where he was supposed to be. Paul Morgan looked at his wife and his daughter and listened to his son breathing quietly in the back room, and understood that this was the specific shape of a life that is well and truly lived, not without difficulty, not without dark passages and forced choices and things that had cost more than they should have, but real from the ground up, built on honest ground, and his and hers, and entirely, finally, home. The snow fell light and steady outside the window, and the lamp burned warm on the table, and Mamie Conley Morgan looked at her husband with those dark, direct eyes that had first assessed him over a sluice channel in October of 1880, and she smiled with the full, unguarded completeness of a woman who has won everything worth winning. He smiled back. 2 years of watching from across a boundary line, one knock on a door, and everything that mattered in the world right here on this side of it.